We're going to connect Power BI to our Microsoft list today. I'm going to show you how to use this with all of the field types. So that includes person fields, single and multi-value, choice fields, including multi-value, lookup fields, hyperlinks, image fields, location with coordinates and the address, multiple lines of text, and manage metadata. If you don't need all of these, just click ahead to the parts you need. I added chapters in the video description. We will also be creating a hyperlink directly to the item in the list in edit mode. And for our multi-value fields, we're going to display them comma separated and let you filter by the individual values. We're using task data here. We created this in part 1 of this video series as kind of a DIY planner. I added a few of the more complicated, weird list field types to this list, even though they're not particularly useful there, just as a demonstration of how the fields work in Power BI. The concepts here work the same for any kind of Microsoft list. So that includes SharePoint lists because it's the same thing. If you've been following some of my other videos, you might expect that we're going to be pulling multiple lists into one model, and we will. So that's going to be the next part in this video series, but today is all about creating the data model. We're using Power BI Desktop today, which is free. If you are unable to use the desktop app for whatever reason, I have another video on how to connect directly to the list in the browser. So feel free to check that out. I'll link that in the video description also, but let's get started. So here we are in Power Automate Desktop. We're going to go to the Get Data button in the toolbar and select the More option at the bottom of the list. From here, if you type in the word SharePoint, you'll see you have options for SharePoint folder, SharePoint online list, and SharePoint list. The SharePoint online list is the one that you want for Microsoft lists because Microsoft lists is the cloud product. SharePoint list is for on-premise SharePoint. So we're going to click connect. And it wants the site URL here. So if I open the list that I want to work with, the URL that we want here is going to be everything before the word lists in the address bar. So for me, this is what I want to copy. And the list that we're working with today has all of the funky columns on it. So we've got a work stream column here. This is a lookup column. It looks up to a second list. We have some date fields, we have a choice field, we have percentage complete. This flags field is multi-value choice. I have a manage metadata field here. I'm going to show you how that works. I have a hyperlink type column here. I have a location field. The location field expands in Microsoft lists to coordinates, the address, city, state, zip, that kind of thing. We also have an image field, so I'm going to show you how to get to the images. And I have multiple lines of text that is rich text, and I have multiple lines of text that is plain text. So we're going to see what those look like on the Power BI side. Coming back to Power BI, I'm going to paste my site URL here. And then I have an option to select an implementation. This is basically the version of the connector. It defaults to 2. We're going to leave it on 2. I have another video that explains the differences between the 1.0 and 2.0 implementation, so I'm going to link that in a card on the screen, but we want 2. There's another option for a view mode down here. We're going to leave this on all because I want to get all of my columns and all of my rows from SharePoint. If you only need things in a very specific view, then you can use the view mode drop down. So I'm going to click OK. This drops us into a list of the contents of our site. So I'm going to select the list or multiple lists that I want to pull here. We're going to use this opening a restaurant example. So this is a list of tasks. So from here, I want to click on transform data instead of load. That's going to let us clean up and expand our fields. So here's what we're working with. You'll see that some of these fields have table and list in the field contents. So table means that there's multiple values. Assigned to is a person type field. There can be multiple people that these tasks can be assigned to. Any field that has multiple values, you do not want to expand in your main list because it's going to cause row duplication. It'll create a row for every single item in that multi-value field. What we want to do instead is to expand those values in a separate table and then relate them with a relationship in the Power BI model. I'll show you how to do that. It's just not something that a lot of people that aren't used to working with databases are used to seeing. So we're running multiple queries on the same list to create multiple tables for a relationship. So I'm going to right click on this query and duplicate it twice because I have 2 multi-value fields. So do this for as many multi-value fields as you have. I have one that's assignees. So I'm going to double click on this, rename it, call it assignees, and one for flags. So flags are basically like a tags column. Then what we're going to do is come back to our assignees, and then we're going to look for the ID field from SharePoint. All lists have a unique ID field. It's called ID. If you have trouble finding it, you can go to the View tab in the query editor, then click Go to Column and type in the name ID. That's this one here. So with the ID column selected, I'm going to hold down Control on my keyboard and select Assigned To, and then right click on Assigned To and click on Remove Other Columns. That leaves me with just the ID and the Assigned To field, and then we can expand out Assigned To here. Just click on the double arrows. And I like to uncheck this Select All box here and select just the fields that I want to expand. So title field is going to be the person's name. You can also get their email here, and you could take their department if you wanted to. I don't need it. And then click OK. So you can see that we have more rows now. That's fine. Those are all of our assignees related to all of our tasks. So for example, this item ID of 9 has 2 people on it. You can rename this to Assigned To Name, and then do the same thing with your flags. So if I come over here and we're going to go to my flags column, this is just a choice field with multiple values allowed. And you'll see this one has some null values. So I'm going to select flags and hold down Control, select ID because we want both of those, and then right click, remove other columns. Now I can expand out our choice values in flags. The reason why we are doing this in a separate table is so that we can filter on the individual flag values. It's possible to expand comma-separated values for choice fields in a table, but what happens is when you go to filter on something in there, you're filtering on the entire list of comma-separated values, and that's not useful. So we're going to expand out our flags. We're going to click on Expand to New Rows, and then we're going to remove the blanks. So if I click on this triangle here, click on Remove Empty. Always remove the empty values for these tables. These are called dimension tables in the data modeling world. Then head back to our original list. So I'm just going to call this tasks because that's what it is for a specific project. And now we have some cleanup to do on this list. So for example, the date fields I have set to show date only in SharePoint. They're showing as 12 a.m. here. So what we can do is just select all of our date fields that we don't need the time for and go to the Home tab in the query editor and select the date type from the drop down here and set it to date. That'll take off that 12 a.m. time. So you'll notice that priority and bucket values all have numbers in front of them. Those are coming from my choice values in the Microsoft list. I intentionally put numbers in front of these just to make them way easier to sort because both SharePoint and Power BI are going to want to sort these alphabetically. So if you have numbers in front of them, they'll automatically sort the way you want when you choose to sort by that field. So next we have flags here. So flags was our multi-value field that we expanded in a separate table. If we want to be able to show the comma separated values for flags, say in a table visualization, we can also expand that into a string here. We want to do both because we want to maintain that single value table for filtering, but also show the comma separated values. So I can click this double arrows to expand. And instead of expand to new rows, I'm going to do extract values. It wants me to select a delimiter. I'm going to do custom and then do comma with a space after it. That just looks nicer than just a plain comma. So you notice that the blanks didn't expand. That's fine. If you right click on this column and then click on replace errors and then put in null here, it'll replace the errors in this column with blank. It's not going to read as null in text. It'll just show blank. Looks like I have another date type field here that I can change the type of. If you want to keep your applied steps clean, you can go back to the step that was doing the type changes and then add another action here. So if I set this field to date and then click on insert, it didn't add a step here, it just updated this step. It just keeps things looking cleaner. All right, managed metadata. So managed metadata in SharePoint is kind of like global tags. What these let you do is use the same list of values across multiple sites. You don't see them used very often just because the user experience for creating and managing the tags is very poor, but you do see them pop up occasionally. So now let's move back to our final step on applied steps here. That was this replace errors. This is a single value field. If it were multi-value, I would expand it in a separate table like we did for assignees and flags, but it's not. It's single value. So I'm going to expand it here. These double arrows, we select that and then select the label property here. So the label is the text label in the field. If you want the term ID, you can take it, but I don't need it for anything. So click OK. You can see it pulled the label values in. If you want this to be friendly or named, you can rename all of the fields that you want to at the end. I like doing it all in one step at the bottom. It makes things less confusing when you're looking at the steps later. Next is our hyperlink field. You can see that it has the link in here. We don't need to do anything with this one right now, but we will later when we get to data types after we load our data. So location. Location fields in Microsoft Lists are interesting. So for example, if I open up one of these list items, I can type in a location, but it'll pop up. So when I select this, it puts in the address here. Back on the SharePoint side, you can choose which parts of this are expanded into the list in the column settings. So you can choose to expose all of these on the list side. On the Power BI side, you can do the same thing. So back here, I have the option to expand to get the coordinates, the city, state, etc. Some of these you'll have to expand twice. So for example, address now has the option of expanding also, so I can get the city, state, address, country, region, postal code, etc. What you want to expand here depends on how you want to display it in visualization. If you're using the filled map, which selects an area to fill, like a zip code or a city, then you're going to want the zip code or city. If you're using the bubble map that just does a dot on a particular location, then the coordinates is the best one to use. Expand whatever you need here. I'm going to take the full address so that we can see what it looks like. I probably already have these expanded in here, but that's okay. And then the coordinates, you can do the latitude and the longitude. This is a better format to use versus the SharePoint expansion, because the SharePoint expansion is, as you'll notice from this column here, showing point with the two values surrounded by some text. So that's harder for Power BI to interpret. So we've got that expanded. These need to have the data type set on the model side. We'll get to that when we're done in Power Query. The image, if you expand this, has the file name, server relative URL, ID, server URL, and thumbnail renderer. The only one of these that had a value, as far as I could tell, was the file name. So I'm going to expand the file name. We're going to use that file name to get a thumbnail image. When you use image fields in a Microsoft list, it'll automatically name them with these image attachment, etc. file names. That's fine. So multi-line of text has two types, plain text and rich text. Rich text is going to be the one with formatting and hyperlinks. It comes through terribly on the Power BI side. So if I click on this, you can see it's got a bunch of HTML in it. It's not as easy as you would expect to separate out this HTML or even to render this HTML in most of the visualizations in Power BI. So I would strongly recommend, instead of trying to work with this, to just use plain text fields when you're wanting to pull it into the Power BI side, particularly because this is referencing classes and things that aren't going to exist as far as Power BI is aware. So it's not going to be able to use a lot of this. So we're going to leave that alone. The multiple lines of text, you'll notice, comes out just fine. And here's the location stuff that was expanded from SharePoint. If you want the information about the user who created the item, you can expand that here. It's going to say that it's expanding to new rows, but created by is a single value field, so you can expand it here and it won't cause row duplication. So do the same thing we did earlier. Take the title. Title is the person's name. Same thing for modified by if you want that. So last but not least, let's talk about our lookup field. Here's my lookup field. If I expand this, you'll notice that I only have lookup ID and lookup value to work with. If all you need is the text label on that lookup field, you can expand lookup value here. If you need properties on the related item, then you're going to want to make a dimension table out of this. So let's go through how to do that. So if I click on recent sources up here, this top one is going to be the site that I just connected to get these lists. So in there, we have a list for that lookup field. It was called workstream. I can load this. You'll see I've got a bunch of properties related to those items. So that's typically what you use lookup fields for, is if you have additional fields you want to track about whatever choice value you are adding. So we can expand the owner field here. That's a person field to get their name. And then if I scroll over, there's an ID field here. So I'm going to take the fields that we want to use, maybe just these three. Hold Control to select those with the ID, right click, remove other. This ID field is going to be the one that we use in our relationship. So now if I come back to tasks and I expand the lookup field to get the lookup ID, this will let us connect the two tables. The rest of this we have to do on the modeling side in a bit. So we have all of our list fields. We want to do two more things. We want to create a column that has the link to the item in lists. That'll make it so that when we're using it in tables, people can click the row and be taken to the item in Microsoft Lists. So we're going to create that, and we're also going to create the hyperlink for the image file. We're going to go to Add Column up here and choose custom column. Custom column is going to let us enter a formula. I'm going to call this item URL. And in here, we need to craft this dynamic URL. It's going to use the list URL, which will stay the same, and the item ID, which will be dependent on the row in our data. So if I come back to our list, the list URL is whatever comes after the word lists in the top bar, this word here, up to the next slash. So this is our list URL. I'm going to copy this, put in a double quote, and paste it. Then we need to add in the form URL. So the form is going to be, depending on if you want the link to go to the view or the edit form, edits form.aspx question mark ID equals. Then go outside your double quotes, do a space and another space. That's how we concatenate two strings. And now we need our ID. So the ID is a numeric field. That means we need to convert it to text in order to concatenate it, because Power BI won't concatenate a number onto a string. So we're going to do a formula that is number dot to text, and then open parentheses, and then select our ID field, this one here, and then close the parentheses. There's another step you can do here if you want to. You don't have to, but if you want this to open in Microsoft Lists instead of in SharePoint, what you can do is add an and sign and do a double quotes, an and sign, env equals web view list. That's going to open it in Microsoft Lists instead of SharePoint. And then click OK. So for these custom field steps, I like to rename them so that I know what they're doing, because added custom isn't very specific. So you can right click on this and then click on properties and call this custom item URL. Just makes it easier to figure out what's going on later. So if I select one of these, I can copy this and paste it into a browser to make sure it works. It's always good to do that. So there we go. It's opened in edit mode. If you want this to go to the view form instead of the edit form, all you do is take this word edit out of your custom field and put in disp. Disp stands for display, I think, and use that instead. So you'll notice that the boxes aren't highlighted. It still lets you edit if you click on these, but it looks less editable from the outset. All right, so back here, I have one more field. This one's a bit niche. Skip ahead if you don't have image fields, but I did want to cover it because it's not something that you see very often. In my list, here's my image. If I open up this item and scroll down to that image field, so this image field, if I right click on it here, I have the option to inspect. You can't do this from the list view, only from the form view, but when I inspect this, it gives me the URL for that image. If I right click this, I can copy it, paste it in a text document just to look at it. Here's what that looks like. It looks super garbled, but it actually makes sense in context. So right here is our file name. It's just got the symbols, those square brackets, replaced with %5D. And right here is the size of the thumbnail. You can change this size to whatever you want. It's in pixels. So if you want your thumbnails to be bigger when they're displayed in Power BI, you can do that. Just set this to like 80, something like that. I'm going to copy this and we're going to use it in our formula. So back in Power BI, our image file name was called image.filename. I can add one more custom column. We're going to call this image URL, put in double quotes, and then paste in that link. So we need to adjust this a little bit. It's got a static reference to that file name right now. We need to replace this with a dynamic reference. So erase the file name. It'll be whatever ending in .jpg, .png, whatever in the single quotes. Erase that, and then we're going to close this first part of the string with a double quotes. We're going to do a space and another double quotes to open the second part of the string. Now we need to insert our file name in here. That was image.filename right here. We're going to insert that, and then we're going to do another space and space. That's going to concatenate it with both sides of the string here. And then decide if you want to change the thumbnail size. I'm going to change this to like 80. I want to point out while I'm in here, in case you do skipping ahead later, that you also have to set this size in tables. If you show this in tables, it doesn't automatically know what size to display it, despite the size that it is getting from SharePoint. The other thing I need to do is where it says /items here, this is the item in the SharePoint list, the item ID. So we need to dynamically insert this as well. So similar to the name, I'm going to put in a double quotes right after that single quote, take out the 14, that's the item ID, do a space and space, another double quote, and then we need to get the ID in here in text. So we're going to do number.toText Power Query is case sensitive, by the way. So the first letter of each of these words is capital. That's important. And then insert our ID, close it, do another space, and we should be good to go. All right, we're finally ready to load this. I'm going to go to the Home tab and click on Close and Apply. So if you've left the option to auto-create relationships in Power BI on, it may have already created your relationships for you. I like to create them myself because I find the auto-creation to be a little bit iffy sometimes. So I went over to the Model View tab, and here's our tables. I'm going to kind of arrange these nicely. Now we need to relate these to each other. So find your ID field on your primary table. Mine was this tasks table, and then relate the ID field on your multi-value fields to that field by dragging them one on top of the other. The lookup field is going to be a little bit different, but these flags and assignees uses the same ID field here. So it pops up this box. Many to one is typically the cardinality that you want if you're working with multi-value fields. If it defaults to something else because you don't have much data in there yet, you're going to want to change it. We're going to set the cross filter direction to both. This is going to be what lets us filter our main table by our dimension tables. So filter by assignee or flag, then click Save. Do the same thing for your assignees. So drag ID on top of ID. So you notice this one defaulted to 1-to-1. That's not actually right. It's only showing that because I don't have many values in there right now. We're going to do many to one and both directions. Workstream has its own ID. Confusingly, it's going to have the same field name by default as your primary table, but we want to actually relate this ID to Workstream lookup ID. This one is single value, so I don't need to set the cross filter direction to both. It should default to the right cardinality. So now back to the report view. I'm going to throw a table in here just to show you what we have going on so far. So if I drop a few fields in here, you can see that the date formatting is a bit off. So it's going to default to a long date formatting with the full words. Almost nobody wants it to do this. So we're going to change the formatting in a second. I dropped my flags field in here. I just noticed that both the one in the dimension table and the one in the tasks table have the same name. So I'm going to rename this one to flags concatenated. That's going to help avoid confusion because we have two versions of this column and we did that intentionally so that we could still filter by the individual values. So understanding this dimensional modeling is really critical in getting the full functionality out of Power BI. So my flags table here has the flag labels, the individual values. I can drop this as a filter on this page to filter by the individual values. So for example, this one, but still see the comma separated values in the column. The person type fields work a little bit differently. They don't expand the same way. You can't just directly expand them in Power Query to get the comma separated values. You have to write a little bit of DAX to do that. So we're going to do that next. So we're going to select our tasks table. We're going to create a calculated column on tasks. You could do this with a measure too, but I'm trying to keep the DAX intentionally straightforward so that it's easier for people who are new to Power BI. So we're going to create a new column. We're going to call this assignee names, and we're going to set it equal to calculate. So calculate is a function that forces the DAX to use the relationship context for the thing that it's evaluating. And then concatenate X. Concatenate X is an iterator function, meaning it's going to iterate over the values in the table and do a thing. This is how we get the comma separated values for the related table, which is assignee. We're going to iterate over our person table with a single values. And the expression we're going to use is to just get the name from that table. So we're going to type in the assignee name, their name field, then another comma. And for the delimiter, I'm going to do double quotes, comma, space, double quotes. It's going to comma separate it. And then you can order it by their name in ascending order, whatever you want. So I'm going to select name, comma, ascending, then close our parentheses and then close the parentheses again. So you can format this if you want to. Shift Enter goes down a line in the DAX editor. You don't have to format it, just makes it more readable. And click the checkbox. Now, if I drop that column into our table, you can see that it has comma separated those assignees. If I want to filter on individual assignees, I can do that with our dimension table. So if I drag the assigned to name from the related table onto this page, you can see it has the individual values here. I can filter on a person and it'll filter those rows down while still showing the comma separated list. So now let's do our field formatting. So the way I like to do this is in the model view because the model view will let you format multiple fields at the same time. In here, if I select all of our date fields, I'm just going to search date and then hold Control, select multiple. There's a column for date time format. So you can select whichever type you like. So now it looks like a normal date field. So next we want to fix our URL fields. I'm going to go back to the model view again. I'm going to search for URL, and there's two different types of URL fields in Power BI. There's image URLs and there's web URL. I'm going to go under advanced and set the data category. So the data category we want to be image URL. Similar thing for the item URL. So select that and set the data category to web URL. That's going to make it a clickable hyperlink when we show it in the table. Now back in my report view, I can take this title field here, select our table, click on the little caret next to title, go to conditional formatting and web URL, and in here, search for our item URL. So it's going to take, it says first item URL, but there's only ever one per row. So we're going to click OK, and that makes these links clickable here. If I select one of these, it opens in Microsoft Lists. You'll notice it added a total down here. It's because it's trying to summarize stuff. So we can turn this total off if we don't want it. But I do have data in this data set that I want to total, like estimated hours. If you want to turn it off though, it's under this paintbrush icon. Just search for the word totals and toggle it off. So same thing with the decimals, by the way. If you don't want to show all of your decimals, you can just select your field and then go to the format, and this box right here is the number of decimal places. So you could set this to 0 if you want to. Similar thing with percentage complete. If I want to show that as a decimal, it's doing an auto summarization of sum of percentage complete, which you almost never want to do. You can change this to average here. You can also change the auto summarization in this summarization drop down up here. That'll change it everywhere that it's used. We could set this to average or don't summarize. Don't summarize will just not automatically summarize it. And then we can choose to display it as a percentage with 0 decimals. So for our lookup field, I'm going to take this out to give us some room. Since it is many to one, I can just drop fields from that lookup table into this table and it'll just work. So I'm going to rename this. So this is the stream owner, and this title field was the work stream name. So I can show these in the table and it's automatically going to pull them from the relationship. That was our lookup field. We've got 2 more to handle. Those are the location and the images. For our location fields, I've got some of these in here twice because I expanded them twice, but these ones with the dot are the ones we expanded in Power Query. Those are the ones we're going to use because the coordinates were in a better format. So latitude, set the data category to latitude, and longitude set to longitude. You'll notice it added an icon here next to the field. That's how you know it's working. Same thing with the rest of these locations. So if I wanted to do the state, there's a category for that. There's one for postal code, country. You don't necessarily need all of these, by the way, just the ones you want to show. And address. So now if we want to put these on a map, it makes 0 sense to count tasks on a map, by the way, but just working with the data set that I have right now. So the 2 maps that you will find most frequently used are this map one here and the filled map. So this map uses dots to show location. So if I have something I'm measuring, which I should probably have a measure in here, let's create one real quick. I'm going to count tasks. So I'm going to create a new measure. I'm going to call it count tasks equal to count rows in our tasks table. You don't necessarily have to create a measure. It will auto summarize things that you drop into visuals, but I like to be explicit about what I'm measuring. It also gives it a friendlier name, so it makes more sense. So I'm going to drop this in the bubble size. That's going to be how big the bubble is. And then for our locations, we're going to use the latitude and longitude. You can use your city, state, country address for these dots. Something I like to do for these, by the way, is to just set the map settings to style grayscale. It just helps the dot points jump out more readily so you can see them better. For the filled map, we want to add the fields that we want to be filling. So that's typically like a country, state, zip code, that kind of thing. I'm going to do state and postal code. So it's going to create a hierarchy out of these in the order that you drop them in. So put your bigger buckets on top. So I put state on top and then postal code underneath. What that lets you do is turn on drill down, and then you can drill into the different levels. So I can click into Minnesota and it'll show me the 2 things highlighted in Minnesota. Again, we can set this to grayscale to be able to see things more easily. The drill up, drill down is pretty cool. So lastly is our image fields. So I drop in the image URL field. I'm going to take a couple of these off here. You'll notice that it's showing a broken link icon. That's because Power BI Desktop can't handle the authentication that is needed for it to display these images. If you put your images on a public website, it will work in the desktop version. If you're using images stored in SharePoint, then you need to publish before you can see those thumbnail previews. So before we do that, I want to go and make sure that we have the right size being used. So if I go to the paintbrush icon and then go to the image size category, it's got a height and width here. So my thumbnails I set in that calculation to 80 by 80. So I'm going to set that here. The reason why we set it in both places is because if you set it to something small in the column calculation and then have a bigger size here, it'll be blurry. So just set them to be the same and they should be more clear. So I'm going to publish this now so that you can see the images in the web. I also want to point out that if you want to be showing your data by year, month, fiscal year, quarter, that kind of thing, it's a very good idea at this point to add a date table to your data model. I have a video on date tables. I'm going to link it in the video description that lets you do date-time intelligence functions. I'm going to publish this with the publish button in the toolbar. It's going to put it in the Power BI web app in the workspace that I choose. So it asks me which workspace I want to put it in. I'm going to put it in the My workspace for now. If you want this to automatically stay up to date, you need to schedule refresh on it in the Power BI service. I'm going to go over that real quick also. So in Power BI at app.powerbi.com, you can get to this in the app launcher in Microsoft 365. I'm going to go to my workspace and look for the thing that we just added. So that's this report here, single list demo. If I go in and look at the report, so if I scroll down, I only have a couple of images in here. You can see that the images did render. I want to point out that I've experienced issues with displaying SharePoint images when you have a huge number of them. So I think it's potentially throttling something like that where it doesn't like to pull 2,000 images from SharePoint when it loads reports. So I would only use this if you have smaller lists. Otherwise, having images hosted on the public web works much better than images in SharePoint. But while we're on the web, I want to show you scheduled refresh. You do have to set the authentication type when you schedule refresh on Microsoft Lists sources. So in this view, if I go to the semantic model for the thing that I just published and click on schedule refresh, down here where it says data source credentials, historically, this has almost always thrown an error because it tries to use anonymous credentials for SharePoint sources by default. I don't know why this is showing no error for me today. This is literally the first time this has ever happened. But you can click on edit credentials here. Make sure it's set to OAuth 2. And the privacy level just has to do with what kinds of data you're combining. So typically you'll want this to be organizational, but that doesn't affect your refresh. It's really OAuth 2 that you need to pay attention to. So sign in and then under refresh, turn it on and choose the frequency and time. Pro tier gives you 8 refreshes per day. Make sure to hit apply when you're done. This video is all about how to connect to your Microsoft lists or SharePoint lists in Power BI and how to model that data. I'm going to be working on a video next on how to combine multiple lists into a single table. This would be for if you have lists with the same structure used across multiple sites that you're trying to show in one place, as well as another video on how to visualize the data set that we're working with. So subscribe if you want to be notified when those come out. Otherwise, thank you for watching and I hope you have a great day.